right, my name is Kinney Rorrer. I'm a great fan of old-time string band music. I've loved it ever since I was a kid. My dad's uncles, Charlie Poole and Posey Rorrer, made records back in the 1920s, and we had an old Victrola at home, and I used to play those records and got hooked on them as a kid. I used to lie on the floor and play them on my sister's little record player when I do my math homework, which is probably why I didn't do very well in math. And I would listen to those old 70s and I just play them over and over again. And Charlie Poole's widow, my dad's aunt, came to live with us for a while back when I was a teenager. And she would get me to play her husband's records on the Victrola for her. And I'd bring a kitchen chair and sit it down in front of the Victrola. And she would remind you of Aunt Bee off the Andy Griffith Show. She wore her hair up in a bun, wore gold rimmed glasses, and always wore an apron. And she'd sit down in a chair, and I'd ask her, I'd say, what do you want to hear? And one she would always ask for first was Budded Rose. Now, as she's listening to that record, remember it's her husband playing the banjo and singing. It's her brother playing the fiddle on the record. And when Charlie would sing that last verse about, darling, meet me up in heaven, that's my true and earnest prayer. If you love me here on earth, dear, I'm sure you'll love me there. And the tears would just be rolling down her cheeks. She'd reach in that apron pocket and pull out one of those little flowery handkerchiefs and push up those gold rimmed glasses and start wiping her eyes. And that was the first time it dawned on me that this is more than just music. It really means something. It was a part of these people's lives. And I got hooked on it, and I've never gotten over it, thank goodness. My dad, who lived with him for about 10 years, couldn't remember how many records he made. So we would go out looking for records, and when we'd get 4 of them, my dad said, well, I think that's all of them. Then we'd find one, another one, a 5th one, and he'd say, oh, I'd forgotten about that one, so that's all he made. Then we'd find a 6th one. He'd say, oh, well, I'd forgotten about that one. We finally got up to 30 of them. And then, of course, he made 6 others on other labels. His brother-in-law, Posey Rorrer, the fiddler, made 54 records. He made more than Charlie did, actually. And I just grew up listening to those records. And Norman Woodleaf, who played the guitar on those first 2 records that Poole and Rorrer made, lived near us. And sometimes on Sunday afternoons, there'd be a knock on the front door, and you'd open the door, and there would stand Norman Woodleaf, and he'd come in, sit down, take off his coat and hat, and sit down on the couch. He'd pick up my brother's guitar, and he'd start playing tunes on it. And I just got immersed in it. And from the stories that Norman told, my dad told, then later I was very fortunate to get to play with Lonnie Austin a lot, who recorded with Charlie Poole, made 12 records with Charlie Poole. And Lonnie, when he retired from West Virginia and moved back to his old home place about 4 or 5 blocks from us, I'd get to play with him a lot. And he'd tell me stories and sing me little songs that Charlie used to sing and this kind of business. Well, I think that session is overlooked because it produced some mighty fine records. That 12-inch version of Kelly Harrell doing the wreck on the Southern Old 97, that's the only version of it I've heard that has all those verses in it. And when I sing the song now, I use some of those very same verses. I don't use all of them, but the first 2 verses he uses in the song are the first 2 verses I use in my version of it as well. And I think, Ernest Stoneman produced some very fine songs there as well. The Wreck on the C&O and John Hardy, and they produced some very good music, and it was very well done. And it's a shame it's been kind of neglected or overlooked. And remember, that session would have been 2 years before the Bristol Sessions. So they were, Ralph Peer was in Asheville before he was in Bristol. I was a history teacher for 37 years. And so much of this music reflects the local culture and history. And I love not only the music, but I love the history that goes with it and the people who made it. And I want to know about them, why they made records and how many records they made. And I love a guy named Wilmer Watts, who was from Belmont, North Carolina. He worked in the cotton mills in Belmont, and he recorded a powerful song called the Cotton Mill Blues. And I drove down to Belmont twice just to see the mills that he worked in. And I used to quote lines from that song to my students when I would be talking about the cotton mill workers in the rural South and the villages in the South in the early 1900s. And how they drew people from the mountains. They recruited people from the mountains. They actually sent out recruiters into the hill country to bring people to work in the mills, like at Freeze, Virginia, where Kelly Harrell and Henry Whitter lived. And Ernest Stoneman worked as a carpenter up there, I guess, building mill houses. So they all had some connection with the mill culture at the time. And I'm fascinated by their stories. I used to quote my students that song that Dave McCarn recorded. He was in a strike, cotton mill strike, textile strike in 1930 in Gastonia, where people were killed as a part of that strike. And he recorded a song called Cotton Mill Colic. I'm going to starve, everybody will. You can't make a living in a cotton mill. And I used to tell the story to my students of how he went to Memphis, Tennessee. He lost his job in the strike, of course. He was hoboing with his younger brother. They arrived in Memphis, Tennessee. He went into a music store to pawn his guitar because he had no money. And they needed a place to stay and something to eat. And he was going to sell his guitar. And he said there were some black musicians in there buying strings for their instruments, probably Memphis jug band guys, I guess. And he heard them talking about making records. And they said, yeah, we're here to make records. And he said, well, where are you making records? And they told him. And he went down there. And Ralph Peer, who was supervised the Asheville session, was there. And he asked Ralph Peer about making records. And Peer said, well, play something for me. So he said, I sang a song for him and played one. And Peer said, well, we've already finished for the day, but if you want to come back tomorrow, we'll record you. And he said, well, we don't have any money for any place to stay. And Peer said, well, I'll advance you $10. And they got some money. And so the next day he recorded Cotton Mill Colic, a guy who was in the cotton mill strike. And as I said, I used to quote that song to my students. And the line that I would quote for them that always got a reaction was, I'm going to starve, everybody will. You can't make a living at a cotton mill. The poor are getting poor, the rich are getting rich. If I don't starve, I'm a son of a... And I would hesitate. You know, he didn't say the word. He just said, gun, son of a gun. But I would pause when I'd say, poor getting poor, the rich getting rich. If I don't starve, I'm a son of a... And the students would go, and I said, gun. What did you think I was going to say? But it always got a reaction. And I told students, you know, when Jimmy Rogers recorded TB Blues, he was dying from TB. And he knew he would die from it. And to hear a guy sing, you know, I'm dying of the old TB, and know that he was dying of TB, that carries a lot of weight with me. That was authentic. That was as real as you can get. And that's one reason I love the music. You know, these people were the real thing. And it's interesting, you look at their pictures and in the record catalogs, and they have on bow ties and nice suits, and they're dressed very nicely. But ordinarily, you'd have seen them in a pair of bib overalls with lint in their hair, you know, working in a mill. My mother worked in a mill for 52 years. And I remember so well when I was a kid, she'd come home, her hair would be the color of the yarn she was running that day. Her hair would be yellow or purple or green. And that was long before girls started doing it now. Her hair was already purple or yellow, and it came from the lint in the mill. And I worked in a weave room myself on a third shift 6 nights a week. And it gave me an appreciation of what Dave McCarn and Wilmer Watts and my own mother and my father went to work at 14. Charlie Poole went to work in a cotton mill. Charlie was illiterate. He couldn't read and write his own name. And one of the reasons I admire Charlie Poole is when he went to New York, he didn't have an agent. He couldn't read a stop sign. And he goes into the Columbia Record headquarters in the Gotham Hotel, Gotham Bank building, there in New York City, and asked for an audition. Here was a guy who couldn't read and write, who had to pay his own way to New York. That took a lot of courage to do that. And he did it sober, you know, which was really courageous on his part and out of character on his part. But I really like that. I think that I admire those people. I love their music. People said when I was born in the Leakesville, North Carolina hospital, the doctor vaccinated me with a Victrola needle, and I never got over it. And I'm glad he did. I've never gotten over it, and I hope I never do.